Welcome to the first public library panel of the fall 2021 IWP residency. It's been more than a year since we were last here, and we're very grateful to be back in-house. My name is Christopher Merrill, and as the director of the International Writing Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel on identity politics. You will notice that I've just removed my mask. We ask everybody to keep their mask on unless they are speaking from here on the panel. And the second thing I wanted to notice is that we have handouts of all the speakers' remarks in the back of the room here, and they will be online later today or possibly tomorrow. Our website is iwp.uiowa.edu, and there you can find not only the full schedule of events coming up this fall, but also the writers' biographies and samples of their writings. We encourage you to check it often because every day brings new and interesting developments. In recent decades, what in shorthand is referred to as identity politics has had a pervasive role in shaping this country's artistic production. Is such updating of older cultural and social norms also the case where you write? Why or why not? Those are the questions we seek to address here today. And for an American audience, where we have noticed that there are writers coming from many different countries, that's what this country is all about, a country of immigrants. In the last 20, 30 years, there has been a huge swing in what we imagine to be the identity of American writers. This has become particularly problematic in the last 4 years of the Trump administration, the divisive politics that he pursued, and that culminated first in the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests all around the country, and took another form in the insurrection of January 6th of this year, the 1/6 insurrection. Identity politics is at the heart of so much of what we do because what writers ask is who we are, who we have been, and who we might well be. In our customary fashion, without the pizza that we usually offer here, and socially distanced and wearing masks, we have brought together three very talented writers to address these questions on the panel today. We'll invite them to come and sit up here or to speak from here. The panelists are Edwige DRO is a translator, activist, and writer from Côte d'Ivoire, whose stories and essays have been widely anthologized after first appearing in magazines like Popula, This is Africa, and the Johannesburg Review of Books. She is a co-founder of the collective Abidjan Lit and the founder of 1949, a library of women's writings from Africa and the Black world. She has facilitated and judged as well as translated for a variety of writing competitions and has coordinated the Francophone program of Writivism in Uganda. She participates in this fall's residency courtesy of the U.S. Embassy in Abidjan. Muti Nilema is a writer from Malawi whose work has won his country's leading literary prize, the FMB Mau Short Story Prize, and has been longlisted for the Writivism Short Story Prize. His novella, Ta Oreva, a sci-fi thriller about how an act of white genocide forces Nelson Mandela to return to a post-apocalyptic South Africa, was shortlisted for Best Novella at the inaugural 2017 NOMO Awards for African Speculative Fiction. The story won Wit, This Place, opened the 2016 Imagine Africa 500 anthology, and his participation in the fall residency has been made possible by the U.S. Embassy in Lilongwe in Malawi. Finally, Dominika Slowik from Poland is the author of two novels, Atlas Doppelganger, which was a finalist for the 2016 Gdynia Literary Prize, and Zimola, which won several honors, including a Passport Politiki Prize, which is given every year to young artists for outstanding artistic achievement. Ms. Slowik also writes reviews and a regular literary column and a collection of news stories, Samosieke was published just before she traveled to Iowa. Her current work is dedicated to the Anthropocene and climate change. She participates in the fall residency, courtesy of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. State Department, to whom we owe a great debt of gratitude for their longstanding support of the IWP. I wish also to thank Beth Fisher and her staff here at the Iowa City Public Library who make this space available to us. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelists to the table, and we'll begin with Edwige. Thank you.
So I just got to the podium. Hi, everyone. So I am going to be reading a little piece that will be up for discussion. So the title is On Being an African Writer. So much has been written about what it means to be or not to be an African writer that I wonder if I'm not simply adding more meat to the stew here. But since too much meat has never spoiled the stew, but rather has always signified and signaled great wealth, at least in my part of the world, I will add more meat. And how apt it is that even as I am writing about the richness of the stew, whether that is a real stew or the metaphorical stew that is African literature, we are celebrating the win of our new Nobel Prize for Literature, Abdul Razak Gurnah. I totally identify, by the way, as being an African writer. I am an African writer because I am a citizen of an African country. Some might say that if we go by that logic, then I should also identify as an Ivorian writer. And I will respond that it does not work that way because Côte d'Ivoire has not always been what it is today. From 1919 to August 5th, 1960, the eve of independence, Côte d'Ivoire went up an extra 318 miles to the northern city of Bobo-Dioulasso. On the 6th of August 1960, it was decided that Bobo-Dioulasso will belong to Burkina Faso, then known as the Upper Volta. I am also from the Mandé tribe, and this tribe encompasses the populations from the west of what is today Côte d'Ivoire, but also those from the southern and eastern parts of the nation known today as Mali and Guinea. In Côte d'Ivoire today, classifications are made on the Mandé tribe itself, those from the north and those from the south. I belong to the Mandé of the south, and as such, I am connected to the Kru tribe in Liberia. And if we take the rhetoric of the proponents of the Black is King, my ethnic group, the Yakuba, is connected to one of Jacob's 12 tribes. So they say. Well, with all that history, I cannot afford to just be a generic Ivorian because the country Côte d'Ivoire is a colonial invention. And just because the Organization of the African Unity decided in 1963 to keep all the borders as drawn by the colonial powers does not mean that I need to embrace a nationalism that does not speak to me. But it is not because I am an African writer that I'm going to speak for the whole continent of 56 countries, if we include Haiti. I cannot even speak for the whole of Côte d'Ivoire. And it isn't because I am an African writer that I'm going to speak on matters others perceive to be African issues. And here I'm going to be speaking about the controversies that have plagued the term African writer, specifically from the viewpoint of conversation happening in Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm choosing this viewpoint because I have noticed that the argument always revolves around what the West is saying about us, African writers, African literature, and tout cela. And I personally have never been interested in focusing on what the West is saying about us for the simple reason that when we care so much about what others say, it is because there is something about us that we have not resolved. So I am interested in what we haven't resolved. When I use the term African writer, I will be talking about the writer who holds citizenship from one of the African countries. We as African writers say that the West wants us to write on themes that they perceive as African, books that touch on issues of polygamy, abusive fathers, genocide, A war or two are touted in the West as representing real Africa. Yet, what is the situation in our various countries? Read any book blurb published today in Côte d'Ivoire. It will always speak of how a particular book is exposing the ills of society, how the writer wants to alert his or her readers, educate them, sensitize them. From 1934, when Bernard Dadier published his first piece of work, Les Villes, and Ivorian literature as we know it today was born, the function of literature has been to expose the ills of society, to alert, educate, and sensitize readers. And woe to the writer who does not fit into or want to fit into that mold. Some have tried with great success, but the predominant pressure is for literature as education. I wonder if that has everything to do with the lack of infrastructures like publishing houses, bookstores, libraries. For a population of some 23 million, there are 20 public libraries in the whole country, some of which are libraries in name only. A consequence of all this is the production of educational literature. In fact, all the publishing houses in a country heavily rely on producing educational materials because literature exists to educate, to expose the ills in society, to point fingers. And so the art of storytelling is lost. In light of all that, I can't be but an African writer and an African literary activist who, instead of exposing the ills of my society, glorifies its richness through the stories that I choose to tell, the stories that I choose to translate, the Frenchies and the Englishes I choose to write in, and encourage others to write in, because at the rate at which we are going, the stew is about to lack meat altogether. And I thank you.
Good morning. I would like to thank the library for having us here today, as well the International Writing Program for inviting me to the residency. And obviously thank all of you for coming here, also watching us online. Empathy politics. Polityka tożsamości. Identity politics. Oh, I have heard those two words so often during the last few years in Poland that in a way they have lost their original meaning to me, as if a child was repeating them on and on, becoming a senseless rhythmic wave of sound. I was tired of them being misused cynically in politics and media so as to create conflict and disagreement. Yet, when given the list of proposed panel topics to select what inspired us most, I went straight for this one. Why would I do such a thing to myself? I have no idea. Well, maybe I do. While I was writing this, the parking lot behind the library was filled with the gold and black of the Hokies fans. I could see them very well from the fourth floor. Barbecue and beer, tents and pickups, everybody unified within this greater than just a favorite sport identity. And the game was still to be played. Congratulations, by the way. When I was trying to disentangle this knot within me, to speak clearly to you about what identity politics means when you live and create in Poland. Modern Poland is a predominantly white, Slavic, monolingual, and in theory, Catholic country. However, for most of its history, Poland had been known to be a multicultural, multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual state with significant minorities of varied origins: Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans, Russians, Czechs, Slovakians, Lithuanians, Romanis, Silesians. I could go on and on. It was a complex and unfortunately very often turbulent mixture of rich and diverse identities. Then the tragedy of the Second World War happened. The Holocaust, war atrocities, forced resettlements and displacements in accord with the newly established borders were forced upon Poland during the 1945 Yalta Conference. Decades of the communist regime, whose one of utopian purposes was to create universal Homo Sovieticus. Finally, the harsh economic transformation of the 90s, based on the neoliberal values of Thatcherism and Reaganism, left us divided into those able to profit from the change and those left behind. I have an intuition that democracy in the so-called Western world, I do not want to generalize, but Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world are what I know best, was driven into this conflict of values, vigorously used by the politicians so as to create the feeling of a continuous crisis. We know the keywords here: religion, race, gender, and to inspire hate and fear, shifting the social attention away from the economy, from the shortcomings of the capitalist system, and from the failure of the current politics. There is a rift dividing my country that you might find familiar. By the way, the Polish right wing derives much of its inspiration from America's right wing ideas. Liberal versus conservative, churchgoers versus atheists, anti-migrants, pro-migrants, anti-maskers, pro-vaxxers, meat-lovers, vegans, make Poland great again and pro-Europeans, eco-freaks and climate change denialists, and so on. It could very well be a list of the topics prohibited during a family's Christmas dinner if you want to eat peacefully without starting a civil war as soon as the first dish is on the table. Nevertheless, even if the crisis is hyperbolized and induced by the politicians, it does harm real people. Even as we speak, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, is pushing migrants toward Poland's eastern borders, and so the right-wing conservative Polish government has decided to exercise pushback. When the Polish border guards encounter migrants, most of them sick, tired, hungry, cold, almost dying, they transport them back to the borderline, abandoning them in the depth of the cold, dark forest. Children, teenagers, men and women. Those are areas of wild forest covered with swamps, impenetrable primordial vegetation. The official narrative is filled with empty, aggressive words. You probably know this all too well in light of what's happening on the border with Mexico. And another split is added to the list of identity politics wars, those protesting and helping and those fearing and rejecting. So who are we now? Who am I now? What is my identity if it's subject to politics? And why have I, after all, chose this topic to speak to you about, instinctively without any hesitation? As you can see, I am standing in front of you in a t-shirt with a rainbow flag on it, the word in Polish saying, I am against homophobia. A poster child of a progressive identity, a right-wing Polish politician would probably say, readily sarcastically. Maybe I am. As I bought that LI t-shirt with the sheer purpose of wearing it to official presentations, television interviews, readings, and finally for the trip to the University of Iowa in the USA, so I could use all those occasions to manifest my support for the Polish LGBTQ+ community discriminated against in my country. I write about feminism, my protagonists are of different sexual identities, I care for a beyond human point of view, I search for voices of animals and plants. I believe in empathy as the most basic tool in both art and life. My writing is political. I am political. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be reading from my piece, The Tyranny of the Acceptable Lived Experience. I have always found the term lived experience a strange expression. Since experience is only accrued through living, it would therefore be safe to assume that living is already implied in the word experience, warranting the qualifier of lived redundant. But since by today's shape-shifting standards to which we are all constantly playing catch-up, it would be crude of me to educate you on the mechanics of what to me is a borrowed language. So I will grudgingly use the term as is, since it is for now in the zeitgeist, much like other strange expressions like adulting or bazinga. Now that we've got that out of the way, allow me to beguile you with another reluctant capitulation in my short literary journey. For the longest time, I have avoided identifying as any kind of writer, partly because I fundamentally detest, abhor, and abominate labels, and more so the sanctimonious busybodies who assume the monumental responsibility without permission or invitation of determining who or what I am. It is only recently I have, grudgingly again, accepted the moniker of speculative fiction writer, because for the most part it is superficial. A temporary coat I accept to wear only to silence a world that is obsessed with labels and affiliations. I am at liberty, even now, to be unfaithful to this adopted moniker and write whatever the hell I want, be it non-fiction, mysteries, or, God forbid, romance. And most importantly, from any perspective of my choosing. However, it appears such literary elasticity is slowly becoming a privilege of a bygone time, and I am now expected to confine my imagination to a limited spectrum of archetypes. You see, I too am a victim of what I'd like to call the tyranny of the acceptable lived experience. Now, while I am not constrained to only telling stories related to my own identity, for now anyway, this iteration of literary tyranny imposes a deceptively innocuous proposition, as I came to discover a few years ago. Whilst I can evade the obligations of my adopted moniker of speculative fiction writer without consequence, it would appear I will not be accorded the same leniency with this challenge to the literary form, which is, as far as I can tell, a well-meaning crusade to ensure that previously unseen and unheard lived experiences are captured and celebrated in print. My first flesh wound from this ideology of sorts came from what could only be described as a pompous fault finder who created nothing and yet felt qualified to pass judgment on the works of those who bear the emotional cost of actually creating something. A species known in the wild as criticus literarius, the literary critic. One critic's surgical disembowelment of my work in speculative fiction ran for 5 pages of a literary review with a wonderfully complimentary title, Tongue-Tied. While a painful slog to get through, some of the criticism was, to be fair, justified. For instance, my homages to Eurocentric traditions or references to Greek mythology being proof of my non-Malawian inspiration. But what really ruffled the feather of my quill was a snipe at my short story, One with This Place, describing it as, quote unquote, a feminist nightmare, with a female protagonist who, quote unquote, seems to have no agency to make things happen. It is a wonder that this critic did not follow through on this line of thinking and christen my female protagonist a male chauvinist's wet dream. But I digress. Reading between the lines, it would appear the critic expected my female protagonist to conform to a certain archetype, an accepted lived experience of sorts, emblematic of feminine empowerment. In this case, the strong female character. Now, I have nothing against strong women. I married one. But must we satisfy our literary palate solely with a calorie-free diet of strong female characters, even if our intentions are noble? Who says every female character must be a feminist icon? Can't we have female characters who are, quote-unquote, weak, even to a fault, but yet are still enthralling? Now, while challenging tropes is understandable in some contexts, my unease with this literary ideology rests not in its intention, which may be good, but in its implication. For if we begin to set boundaries on our imagination so that only certain stories of certain lived experiences are told or worth telling, does that not also mean, to borrow a current American cliche, that certain stories matter more than others? We are all stories waiting to be told, And each story matters, even if one of them happens to be a feminist's nightmare. If, however, you feel inclined that I should agree with this critic and conform to this emerging tyranny on the literary form, then allow me to finally get African on your ass and leave you with the immortal words of the late great Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe. If you do not like my story, write your own. Thank you.
Thank you all for those wonderful presentations. I just want to say to Muti, it makes me think of the late Marvin Bell's wonderful line, we all know how many times a critic reads a book, less than once. And a famous critic then quoted that line in a review and got it wrong. So, I just want to mention some upcoming events before we turn to questions and comments. This afternoon at Shamball House, reading will be live on Zoom at 5 o'clock with Deanna Dale Angel, Candace Chong, and Imam Baksh. You can find, again, this information on the website, iwp.uiowa.edu. Cinematheque on Sunday at 6 o'clock in the Adler Journalism Building, room 101. Ashkar Farhadi's drama, The Salesman, will be hosted by Salah Obeid. Next Wednesday in the same room, as part of the Iowa City Book Festival, we will welcome a reading with Habib Tangour from Algeria and a returning IWP alum, Pierre Joris, originally from Luxembourg and now in New York. Next Friday here in the library, we'll have the second panel. The topic will be reality hunger, and the panelists will include Habib Tangour, Sana Maher, Fari Az, and Kim Hana. And also next Friday on Zoom at 2 o'clock, the Department of French and Italian, in partnership with the Arabic and Swahili programs, will host a panel and discussion with Habib Tangour and Salah Obeid. And now with that, we can open it up to questions, comments, and speak loudly if you can, so that those who are watching at home can capture the, Hugh will have the microphone going around.
My question is to Muti. You mentioned your label as a speculative fiction author. You intended to be a temporary quote. How do you propose to make sure it's temporary, and is that up to you?
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, fine. Fine. I think, for the most part, I think the only way I can make it temporary is if I explore as many genres as possible. I think for me, the use of speculative fiction is only a vehicle to get across the story. I mean, for example, the story that Chris described in my introduction, is, the return of Nelson Mandela to a post-apocalyptic South Africa. The only reason why I chose speculative fiction as the vehicle for that was because that was the vehicle that made sense for that. But after I wrote that, everyone just plastered the title speculative fiction author on me. So I think the only way I can challenge that is by trying to do other things except romance. Sorry, I know you like romance.
Romance, but why are you saying sorry to me?
No, because I know you like romance.
Well, if you don't write it, other people will write it and I'll read
Exactly, no problem. She just got African on my ass. Okay, so I think the issue is more to explore other avenues that will challenge me, in the hopes that then people will understand that, okay, he's not held by this title, he can do anything he wants. So I think exploring it is all I can do. I can't force people to ascribe whatever title to me. I think that's entirely up to them. But I'd be damned if they try to say that this is all you are. That, for me, is the issue.
First, I would like to thank you all for your brilliant point of views. My question is for Edwige, and it's interesting when you mentioned Abdelrazak Garna on the beginning, because in the Middle East now we are having this argument about him because he was born in Zanzibar, and they are talking him as that he has Yemenis. Somehow he's from Yemen, and but nowadays he's living in Britain. So regarding this, how identify the African writers who are living abroad and writing about their problems there? Are they still Africans to you? This is a question I have since I'm seeing some situations, for example, when the Arab writers are living abroad and writing about the problems there, we just don't identify them as, writers from the Middle East.
Thank you, Salah. I think everybody is claiming now, Abdul Razak Gurna, and all his books are out of stock almost, and he's only 3 of his books have been translated into French. But now that he's won the Nobel Prize, he's like, I won Nobel Prize. And Shoyinka was like, the Nobel has come home. In answer to your question, I personally identify as an African writer. I like that because I'm a provocateur. So I identify that. And yes, I do not think Abdul Razak Gurna ascribe to being confined into any category. So it is not little old me here who is going to say Abdul Razak is an African writer. He defines himself as he wishes to define himself. I do not have any problem with any writer from Africa who wants to live elsewhere, because, as we say, the world is our oyster, and I do take that very literally. The world is my oyster. I will go where I want to go, visa permitting, of course. And I consider those writers from my countries. So Veronique Tajo now lives in England. Previously, she was in South Africa. I do not consider her as less of an Ivorian writer. For me, she is an Ivorian. She holds that passport, or even if she doesn't hold it. So I do not break, the writers. I do not, put them into boxes, because I don't want to be put into boxes. Yeah. So I'm very careful about putting other people into boxes.
Yeah. If I could just add, in her presentation, she made a comment which is really important, especially on the African continent, referring to the publishing, how the situation is for writers in Africa, where it's very difficult to get publishing deals if you can find them, and the only interest that is there is for educational content. So if somebody, for example, from America or from the West comes and is interested in your writing and wants to publish your writing and takes you away from Africa or from the UAE or whichever other place, I mean, the world is your oyster. You go where the opportunities are as a writer. So I think what she said in her presentation about the challenges with publishing, it's a really serious problem. So writers in Africa are left with the opportunities in the West. Those are where the opportunities are, so they gravitate to them. So unless the situation is improved on the continent, publishing deals are there, writers are, promoted.
Literary critics will read.
And they read more than a day once. Then you will have African writers staying on the continent, writing about the continent, and getting opportunities on the continent, which is not the case at the moment.
This gives me an opportunity to make a plug for an upcoming event, Salha, that this question might be also pertinent to the Nigerian writer Helen Habila, who will be here to read in a couple of weeks, who's now settled in Virginia. And it would be, I remember his thinking about these issues when he was here as a participant in the fall residency, and it would be interesting to hear what he has to say about it now. And I see other questions back there.
So this is for Edwige. Edwige, you made this core distinction between the West and the domestic, as it were, both markets and readership. Among the Western perspectives, or rather the chief Western perspective that you you spell out is what one often calls the poverty porn, right? Versus the educational bent of the Ivorian or perhaps in domestic publication. So poverty porn versus educational finger pointing and all of that. It's a pretty deep chasm. But I do wonder about the quote-unquote Western, which I kind of was wondering whether Northern may not be a more fairer, but rather than Western characterization. But in fact, Nigeria has produced in the last 10, 15 years, Helen certainly most included, has produced a complete new set of literature. It's not poverty porn at all. It's all about middle class that's moving across, or not all, but largely about the middle class that's moving across the Atlantic. So, and that's probably the new, maybe hyphenated literature, maybe that's the new identity. I just wanted to challenge this concept that the West wants you to write about poverty. I don't think, that's not what we're reading in the writers that come through the program, at least.
No, I really don't think so. And I think the point I was trying to make was that when writers from Africa, so writers who look like me or who do not look like me, who look like Habib also, so when writers from Africa complain about the way the Northern Hemisphere, the West perceive us, they want to categorize us. I really don't think that the West, categorizes us. I don't care. But it is the way we complain about what the West is doing to us and what, the mold they're trying to put us in. And my argument is here, leave the West be. Like, let them be. Focus on your own issue. The issue is that you are poor. You do not have publishing houses. You do not have literary critics. You do not have literary agents. You do not have sufficient bookstores. You do not have libraries. Let's focus on the issues. Let's look at ourselves in a mirror and know that the problem is with us. Let's leave the West. So that's what I'm actually saying. I actually don't care for the West. In that sense.
I'm gonna jump in with a question to the world being an oyster, picking your project so that you define who you are as an author. These seem contrasted with the image of the migrants that Dominica was raising, and also that come up in the some of the migration stories that perhaps we're also seeing out of African authors. I guess I wanted to ask, beginning with Dominica, but the other authors should feel free to answer, what level does, to use the literary critic's term, agency play in the narratives that who has agency, and how does the agency of the characters, the freedom of the characters and the stories you're telling, reflect your own politics, or either the oppressive or what you see as a path to liberation?
Okay. I already was asked a similar question being here, and I really thought about it, and obviously books I write, they are politics, they are very political, even though maybe not directly, and therefore my protagonists, they do have a certain agenda when I write about them. However, I do not write necessarily about people exactly like me. Even though it's filtered from my experience, I find it pointless just to present one point of view. So actually I have a lot of heroes, a lot of protagonists that present the opposite point of view, because I think this is what is really important, to look for a way, try to find a way to communicate with each other. And my last novel had a very big, one big topic was religiosity in Poland, Catholicism. And from where I come from, like the leftist, non-religious part of Polish art, it is very easy to mock and criticize, and I think it's totally against any purpose. And my book was rather about trying to understand what actually Polish Catholicism is right now. So in a nutshell, I try to write about people with different agenda, even though I obviously have my own purpose in writing about them.
Do you want to jump in, Moti?
Okay. Well, it's an interesting question. Personally, I think as a writer, you need to sort of remove yourself from yourself when you're writing something and try to create characters that would be consistent in terms of their motivations. And part of that sometimes does require you to look at, to say, okay, to sort of look at your character and then decide, okay, why would they do something like that? Like the story I'm working on now, the question that I'm struggling with is I have a character who is seeking power, but I don't understand why anyone would want power, because I don't want power. I don't seek power personally. But there's a character I have that I need to create a motivation for power, but I don't understand that. So part of the work that I'm doing, and this is something I think as writers we all do, is to understand this thirst for power philosophically. What is the driver for that? And in one of my other stories, I depict a murder between a young boy and a white racist in one of my stories. And I remember one person who wrote the story criticized me because I didn't create a very clear distinction that this person is evil and this one is good. I basically had two evil people duking it out, and they're both racists. One just happens to be white, the other one just happens to be black. And I did get some, not flack, but one person actually said, I wished you had made it more clear. And I said, well, that's the thing. It's not like I don't hate this character. I do. And when I was doing research for one of my stories, I looked at what was happening in South Africa. I don't know if you've seen Cry Freedom, the Denzel Washington film. If you watch it all the way to the end, they have a list of black South Africans, some white South Africans who were killed in prison. And they had all these things, fell down the stairs, died of an asthma attack, died from cold, but which is really clear that these people were murdered. And at that point in the film, after the death of Steve Biko, there's no other way to feel but angry, right? And I think as a writer, then I have to say, okay, fine, I'm angry about this, I hate that this happened, but I have to depict this. And I think for the most part, there's a certain kind of exorcism that you need to be involved in, where you exorcise yourself from your views, your politics, your ideas, and tell, Sanam hates this word, but I'm going to use it, Sanam, an authentic story. So yeah, that would be my response to that. Does the politics filter through? Yeah, maybe sometimes. When I've gone back to some of my stories, I see me as like, okay, that's me. But in the moment, I try to be as close to reality as possible.
I think my politics filters through my writing, and I think as a writer also, it is about asking questions. Otherwise, why would we be taking a year, 6 months out of your life, 4 years out of your life to kind of write these things? So you're asking questions. So even when we say and deconstructing also things. So when we say like the world is your oyster, the world is not necessarily the oyster for me. I can't get up and decide to go anywhere I want to in the world. It is difficult, and other people cannot also decide to go where they want to go. So when I say maybe the world is your oyster, it's kind of also ironic. It's like I've been writing this story about the returnees phenomenon. So in 2014, in most of Africa, we had the returnee phenomenon, where Africa was no longer a hopeless continent, but a hopeful continent, where the young Africans who had studied in Europe and in America were returning back home and shattering the glass ceiling, and they were showing in the media or on Twitter, the media doesn't show you. And I started, and African president were meeting with the African diaspora and the African returnees, and I was thinking, who are the African diaspora? So to be called a returnee, must you be the person who comes in with your MBA from Yale and smashing the glass ceiling? What about the person working on the tube in London? Can he not also be described as a returnee when he decides to return? And when we are smashing the glass ceiling, what about the woman or the man who is picking up these glass shatters on the floor? We should be also talking about them. So in this whole world of being your oyster, it's about all of these questions that we ask of ourselves, the focus on the people, you know, for whom the world is not an oyster. And also I hate oysters.
Yeah, hello. I was impressed, all of you guys, and I got a question for Dominica. And you mentioned that your protagonists are of different sexual identities, and I wondered that what type of different sexual identities are you handling, and why do you think it's important to describe these kinds of sexual identities?
Okay, so since 2015 in Poland, we have a government that describes itself as a very conservative one, and because of that, at a certain point during the timeline, they were targeting people within the LGBTQ plus community with like political propaganda and trying to like it was a good strategy, unfortunately, actually, because the voters really focused on that, and because of that, I knew that the representation within the literature, within the storytelling, it is very important. Like my first book wasn't really about that. It was coming from a girl that is heterosexual, white, has parents that are middle class. So it is very like standard writing, not challenging any identities. But with this development in Poland and me maturing and growing up, I realized that if I want to truly write about the world, about people, about empathy, about feminism, it is about people that are not necessarily settled in this very, in this traditional binary gender heterosexual narrative, because honestly it isn't like this, like the world isn't like this. So that's why I started writing about heroes that have different different identities on different levels, sexual interest, but also how they identify within themselves. And it was also a difficult topic for me because I didn't want to impose my point of view, because I'm just an ally. I'm not the representative of the LGBTQ plus society in Poland. So a lot of those texts I consulted with my friends to see if they feel okay about what I'm writing about. And yes, I think that it's what we need in the literature. Like we need we can see the wave of women voices that rose up a few years ago, and this women perspective narrative, not only in literature, but in the movies, in all the art fields. And I think it is the same for challenging this binary point of view regarding our sexual identities.